Space wasn't conquered by hotshot pilots or brilliant admirals, it was maintained by guys holding mops. The history books will tell you that HFY war ended because of a brilliant tactical strike authorized by the United Nations Security Council. They are lying. The most devastating blow to an intergalactic empire wasn't delivered by a dreadnought or a nuclear payload. It was delivered by a 52-year-old sanitation contractor from Ohio armed with a titanium wrench, a deep understanding of HVAC systems, and a rolling cart of industrial solvents. This is the classified truth of how one forgotten man brought down a flagship. The obsidian spear was a marvel of xenological engineering. A massive HFY warship temporarily docked at the Northrop Grumman orbital tether under a fragile 3-day ceasefire agreement. To the diplomats, it was a negotiation table. To the military brass, it was an intelligence goldmine. But to David Harrison, an independent contractor working for Aegis Facility Services, it was just another mess. David didn't care about intergalactic politics or the intricate plasma weaponry housed in the ship's primary batteries. He cared about the acidic buildup in the lower ventilation shafts. The HFY breathed a nitrogen-rich mixture that, when combined with human atmospheric standard, left a sticky, corrosive residue on the grates. His job was to scrub it out before it ate through the temporary umbilical tunnels connecting the alien dreadnought to the human space station. He was deep inside maintenance shaft sublevel 4, a narrow, unlit corridor that smelled sharply of ozone and sulfur. When the universe decided to abandon him, David was scrubbing particularly stubborn patch of bioresin, his heavy-duty respirator hissing with each breath when the deep, resonant hum of the ship's central reactor changed pitch. It shifted from a low vibration that he felt in his boots to a bone-rattling crescendo. Then came the klaxon. They weren't the standard digital sirens of human stations. They were a series of guttural, rhythmic thumps that echoed through the metallic veins of the ship, sounding like a dying heartbeat through the grated floor. David saw the ambient lighting shift from a sterile diplomatic white to a deep blood red. Control, this is Harrison in sublevel 4, David said, tapping the comms unit on his shoulder. I'm hearing the drive spin up. Are they running a diagnostic? Static answered him. Control, repeat. This is Harrison. I need an all clear. Do I need to evacuate? More static, thick and impenetrable. David wiped a gloved hand across his sweat-slicked forehead, leaving a streak of gray grease. He quickly packed his solvents: industrial-grade ammonia, heavy alkaline degreasers, and a proprietary synthetic bleach manufactured by Dow Chemical, specifically for extraterrestrial biohazards, into his reinforced utility cart. He moved toward the primary airlock access, the heavy cart rattling over the deck plates. As he reached the manual release lever, a sickening jolt threw him to the floor. The wrench in his hand skittered away into the dark. The sheer force of the acceleration was impossible. Earth ships built by Boeing or Lockheed had inertial dampeners that eased a crew into slipspace. The Zalithi, however, possessed a localized gravity manipulation technology that simply yanked the vessel out of real space in a fraction of a second. The stomach-churning sensation of a slipspace jump was unmistakable. The umbilical connecting the ship to the Northrop Grumman station hadn't just been detached, it had been violently Sheared off. David pushed himself up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked through the reinforced viewport on the heavy bulkhead door. Instead of the familiar comforting blue glow of Earth or the metallic sprawling architecture of the orbital tether, there was only the swirling violet abyss of an active slipstream corridor. He was gone. Earth was gone. He was locked inside the ventilation network of a hostile alien dreadnought currently breaking the speed of light. Panic, cold and sharp seized him. David was not a soldier. He was a former Union plumber from Cleveland who took high-risk orbital contracts to pay for his daughter's medical school tuition at Johns Hopkins. He had no weapons. He had no survival training beyond standard low-oxygen protocols. He was wearing a standard blue jumpsuit, adorned with the Aegis Facility Services logo, a tool belt, and a pair of steel-toed boots. He sat back against the cold bulkhead, his breathing ragged. For 10 minutes, he simply let the terror wash over him, envisioning the inevitable. The Zalathi would find him. They were a ruthless hierarchic species standing 7 ft tall, covered in chitinous armor with a profound disdain for humanity. They would either execute him as a spy or throw him out the airlock as pest control. But as the initial shock subsided, a gritty, stubborn realization took hold. He was still breathing. The air in the maintenance shaft was stale but oxygenated. David stood up, his knees trembling slightly, and retrieved his titanium wrench. He looked at his utility cart. He had a localized map of the ship's lower quadrant downloaded onto his data pad provided by Earth Intelligence to ensure he didn't accidentally wander into a restricted zone. The map was rudimentary, detailing only the environmental systems and waste reclamation areas. All right, David whispered to himself, the sound of his own voice grounding him. You're not a prisoner yet. You're just a rat in the walls. He needed to understand what had happened. Why did they break the ceasefire? Where were they going? He moved deeper into the labyrinthine ventilation system, following the schematics on his data pad toward the ship's central life support nexus. If there was one thing David knew, it was that no matter how advanced a species was, whether they built pyramids or faster than light engines, they all had to breathe, and they all produced waste. Water flows downhill and air needs to circulate. The ship's infrastructure was a chaotic mess of overlapping conduits. The Zalathi were brilliant physicists but terrible engineers. They built their systems for redundancy but ignored the basic principles of compartmentalization. Their plasma conduits ran perilously close to their atmospheric scrubbers. David crawled through a narrow duct, the heat from the adjacent plasma lines making him sweat profusely. He approached a junction box located directly above what the map labeled as a secondary command node. Peering through the horizontal slats of the vent, he saw them for the first time in their natural element. 2 Zalathi warriors stood over a holographic console. They were massive, their gray armored skin reflecting the harsh light of the displays. David activated the translation module on his data pad. It was a risky move. The module was a prototype developed by DARPA, reverse engineered from a captured Zalathi comms unit. It was meant only for emergencies, as it emitted a faint electromagnetic signature. He pressed the device against the metal grating, praying the ship's ambient Radiation would mask the signal. Words, fractured and robotic, began to scroll. Across his screen, surprise maneuver. Successful. Human orbital defenses bypassed. Tether destroyed. Casualties estimated at acceptable. Trajectory set for the Mars colony. Operation Scorched Earth initiated. David's blood ran cold. They hadn't just fled, they had launched a surprise attack, destroying the space station he had just been standing on, and now this massive dreadnought was heading straight for the new Austin colony on Mars, home to over 2 million human civilians. He wasn't just a stranded janitor anymore. He was the only Earth asset behind enemy lines. Survival on an alien ship required a fundamental shift in perspective. David couldn't outgun them, and he certainly couldn't outfight a 7FT alien Marine, but as he studied the ship's internal layout, a distinct advantage began to reveal itself. The Xylithi were overly reliant on centralized automation. Human ships were built with manual overrides. If an AI failed on an Earth cruiser, a crewman could turn a physical wheel to seal a bulkhead. The Xylithi, in their arrogance, believed their central processing intelligence, the core mind, was infallible. There were no physical valves. Everything was routed through a centralized digital network. To a hacker, this would be an impenetrable fortress. To a plumber, it was a glaring structural vulnerability. They don't have physical fail-safes, David muttered, tracing a complex series of cooling lines on his data pad. If the computer says a pipe is open, it's open. If the sensor is blinded, the computer is blind. He spent the first 12 hours mapping his territory. The sublevels were a tangled jungle of pipes, wires, and dark crawl spaces. He established a base camp in a redundant water reclamation chamber that appeared to be offline. It was damp and smelled of stagnant algae, but it was off the main thermal sensor grid. His first priority was securing a food and water source. The Xylithi consumed a nutrient-dense paste synthesized in massive vats near the mid-decks. David managed to splice into a minor delivery tube meant for the lower deck guards by slightly loosening a coupling with his wrench. He created a slow leak. He caught the gray, tasteless paste in an empty solvent jug. It was vile tasting, like chalk and spoiled meat, but it would keep him alive. Water was easier. He simply tapped into the condensation runoff from the main atmospheric scrubbers. With his basic needs met, David turned his attention to the mission. He had to stop this ship before it reached Mars. He observed the alien crew through the vents. They were highly disciplined, moving in synchronized patrols, but they were also profoundly unimaginative. They adhered strictly to protocol. When a minor pressure fluctuation occurred in Sector 4, a technician didn't investigate physically. He simply recalibrated the sensor remotely from a terminal. David realized he could use their absolute faith in their technology against them. His first act of sabotage was a test. He needed to see how the core mind reacted to a physical analog anomaly. He targeted a secondary thermal exhaust port near the crew barracks. Taking his industrial-grade degreaser, he carefully applied a thick layer of the viscous chemical over the internal temperature sensor. The degreaser was designed to dissolve synthetic bio resins, but it also acted as a potent thermal insulator. Within minutes, the sensor, blanketed by the foam, reported A massive drop in temperature. Through his data pad, David watched the ship's automated systems respond, believing the sector was freezing. The core mind diverted superheated plasma from the secondary drive to the localized heating coils. The actual temperature in the barracks skyrocketed. From his vantage point above, David watched as 4 Xylothi warriors suddenly woke from their rest cycles, thrashing and clicking their mandibles in distress as the ambient heat in their quarters pushed past 120 degrees. The automated doors functioning perfectly according to the ship's safety protocols, sealed shut to contain the thermal anomaly. The warriors battered against the reinforced doors, trapped a makeshift oven of their ship's own making. It took the Xylothi engineering team 20 minutes to realize the sensor was malfunctioning and physically cut the power to the heating coils. By then, the trapped warriors were severely dehydrated and incapacitated. More importantly, the engineering team didn't look for a saboteur. They cursed the core mind, assuming a glitch in the software. They had no concept of a middle-aged human in a blue jumpsuit smearing chemicals on their hardware. David smiled grimly in the dark. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew how to break things. He escalated his operations. He moved silently through the access shafts, a ghost in the machine. He targeted the ship's intricate internal communication lines. The Xylothi used a fiber optic equivalent, transmitting light pulses through crystalline cables. David didn't try to hack the data. He just took his titanium wrench and shattered the physical relay nodes in isolated junctions. Entire sectors of the ship suddenly went dark. On the command deck's monitors, the Xylothi response was chaotic. They dispatched heavily armed patrols, suspecting an Earth commando unit had somehow boarded them. They swept the main corridors, weapons drawn, checking every shadow, but they never looked up. They never checked the ventilation shafts because their structural schematics deemed the shafts too small for their own species and therefore inconsequential. David was a localized plague. He used his synthetic bleach, mixing it with the ship's raw ammonia-based coolant in an isolated mixing chamber. The resulting chemical reaction produced a highly toxic, corrosive chloramine gas. He hooked his utility cart's industrial vacuum in reverse, using it as a makeshift pump to force the toxic cloud through the ventilation ducts directly into the portside armory. The gas was heavier than the alien's nitrogen mix. It sank to the floor, invisible and deadly. When the next shift of guards entered the armory to equip themselves for the Phantom Commando hunt, they collapsed. Within seconds, their respiratory systems severely burned. Panic began to spread among the alien crew. The obsidian spear, the pride of the Xylothi fleet, was bleeding from 1,000 tiny cuts. They were hunting a ghost, an invisible entity that could strike anywhere, turning their own environment into a weapon. In the command center, Commander Xanthus slammed his massive multi-jointed fist onto the holographic tactical table. "Report," Xanthus hissed, his voice translated through David's data pad as a harsh mechanical screech. "Commander, we have lost contact with Sector 7. An officer replied, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Environmental controls are offline. Toxic gas detected. In the port armory, 3 patrols incapacitated. The core mind is reporting systemic hardware failures. But diagnostics show no viral intrusion. Is it the humans? Did they board us? Before the jump, unknown commander. Internal sensors detect no life forms. Outside of Zalithi biology, but. What? Xanthus growled. Sir, they. Failures. They are incredibly primitive. Cables are being physically crushed. Sensors are being covered in unidentified corrosive pastes. It is not a cyber attack, it is an infestation. High above them, concealed behind a rusted grate, David wiped the sweat from his eyes and checked his oxygen levels. He had their attention. Now it was time to take their ship. The psychological warfare was working, but David knew it wasn't enough. Annoying the crew and disabling a few patrols wouldn't stop the obsidian spear from reaching Mars. He needed control. His ultimate target was the Environmental Command Center, ECC. On an Earth vessel, navigation and weapons were the most heavily guarded sectors, but David had recognized the Zalithi's fatal flaw. They were biologically delicate despite their armored exteriors. Their respiratory and thermal requirements were incredibly narrow. If the temperature dropped below a certain threshold, they went into hibernation. If the nitrogen mix fluctuated by more than 4%, they suffered severe neurological degradation. He who controls the thermostat controls the ship. The ECC was located in the heavily fortified midsection of the ship. Sneaking through the vents would only get him so far. The shafts narrowing into impassable filtration micromeshes right before the control room. He would have to breach it. From the outside, he formulated a plan that relied on brute force, human engineering, and sheer audacity. David retreated to the ship's primary hydroponics bay. The Zalithi grew dense fibrous flora used for medicinal processing. The room was massive, humid, and largely unguarded. As it was fully automated, he spent hours dismantling the heavy irrigation pipes, harvesting the thick high-pressure synthetic rubber hoses. Next, he needed a propellant. He navigated to a maintenance locker near the primary plasma drives. The locker contained pressurized canisters of a highly volatile cleaning solvent used to purge the plasma injectors. It was incredibly dangerous, prone to explosive combustion if exposed to oxygen and a spark. Working with agonizing precision, David constructed a rudimentary, high-yield breaching charge. He filled the heavy rubber hoses with the volatile solvent, capping the ends with salvaged valves. He wired a remote detonator using a stripped-down comms relay from his tool belt and the ignition coil from an alien welding torch. It was a bomb built by a plumber. It wasn't elegant, but it was devastatingly practical. The clock was ticking. His data pad intercepted a navigational update. They were 30 hours away from Mars orbit. The Zalathi were preparing to drop out of slip space, power up their weapons, and glass the New Austin colony. David strapped the heavy, sloshing explosives to his utility cart. He looked down at his dirty blue jumpsuit. The Aegis facility services patch barely visible under layers of alien grease and grime. He took a deep breath, securing his respirator over his face. He exited the maintenance shafts on deck 3, stepping out into the polished metallic corridors of the enemy ship. He was completely exposed. If a patrol rounded the corner, he was dead. He pushed the cart as fast as he could, the heavy rubber wheels squeaking against the pristine deck plates. He reached the heavy blast doors of the Environmental Command Center, too tall. Towering Zalathi guards stood at attention, their energy rifles resting against their shoulders. David didn't hesitate. He unhooked a canister of his synthetic bleach, highly pressurized, and hurled it down the corridor toward them. The canister clattered loudly against the floor. The guards instantly raised their weapons, confused by the rolling metal cylinder. Human, one of them barked, aiming its rifle. David ducked around the corner just as the guard fired. The plasma bolt vaporized the canister. The resulting explosion wasn't fiery, it was a violent, rapid expansion of corrosive chemicals. A thick, blinding white cloud of bleach and ammonia derivatives filled the corridor. The guards began to choke and thrash, their respiratory systems overwhelmed by the caustic gas, their armor useless against the chemical assault. David sprinted through the blinding smoke, holding his breath. Despite his respirator, he slammed the rig utility cart directly against the seam of the heavy blast doors. He slapped the makeshift detonator onto the cart, flipped the arming switch, and bolted back down the corridor, diving behind a heavy structural pillar. He hit the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The volatile solvent, constrained by the heavy rubber hoses, didn't just burn, it shattered. The concussive wave ripped through the corridor, blowing out the lighting panels and throwing David hard against the wall, ears ringing, vision blurred. David pushed himself up. Smoke was thick, smelling of burning metal and chemical fire. He stumbled forward. The blast doors, designed to withstand internal decompression, had been buckled inward, blown completely off their tracks by the sheer, uncalculated kinetic force of the improvised explosive. David stepped into the Environmental Command Center. The room was in chaos. 4 Zalathi technicians lay on the floor, stunned and bleeding from the concussive blast. David didn't waste a second. He walked to the primary console, a massive array of holographic interfaces and alien symbols. He didn't know how to read Zalathi code, but he knew plumbing. He knew the universal language of pressure, flow, and valves. He pulled out his data pad, connecting the DARPA translation module directly to the console's primary data port. The screen flickered, struggling to interpret the alien operating system. One of the Zalathi technicians groaned, reaching for a sidearm strapped to his leg. David stepped forward, bringing his heavy titanium wrench down hard on the alien's wrist. The bone cracked with a sickening snap, and the alien howled. Pain. Stay down, David growled, his voice muffled through the respirator. He turned back to the console. The translation module finally locked on, displaying rudimentary English translations over the alien symbols. Atmospheric mix, thermal regulation, gravity plating. David's hands flew across the holographic interface. He bypassed the safety protocols the Zalathi thought were unbreakable because they relied on software, completely ignoring the fact that David had physical access to the root terminal. Let's see how you like the Cleveland winter, David muttered. He accessed the thermal regulation systems for the entire ship, excluding the command center. With a few swift keystrokes, he plunged the temperature across all decks from a comfortable 80 degrees to a lethal -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Next, he targeted the atmospheric mix. He decreased the nitrogen levels by 20% and flooded the ship's ventilation with the raw, unfiltered exhaust from the secondary plasma drives, essentially flooding the ship with carbon monoxide and radiation. Alarm screamed across the vessel. Red emergency lights strobed violently. On the bridge, Commander Xanthus watched in horror as his ship died. The displays showed entire sectors flashing red as the crew succumbed to the sudden, brutal freeze and toxic air. Override the environmental controls, Xanthus roared. I cannot, Commander, the bridge technician shrieked. We are locked out. At the root level, someone is at the physical console in the ECC. Send the reserves. Breach the doors, Commander. The temperature in the corridors has dropped to critical levels. The blast doors are freezing shut. Our troops are collapsing. Xanthus stared at the main tactical screen. The obsidian spear, capable of glassing continents, was completely paralyzed. In the ECC, David Harrison pulled up a heavy metal crate, sat down in front of the console, and rested his wrench on his lap. He watched the ship's vitals plummet. He had taken over the flagship of the Zelithi Armada. Not with codes, not with guns, with a wrench, chemicals, and the stubborn of a man who refused to be overlooked. The obsidian spear groaned, a deep, metallic sound of structural distress that vibrated through the deck plates and into David's steel-toed boots. The ship was dying, choking on its own exhaust and freezing from the inside out. Through the reinforced viewport of the Environmental Command Center, David could see the condensation on the corridor walls rapidly turning into a thick layer of frost. The console in front of him suddenly flared, the holographic interface overriding his lockout for a single localized function. An internal audio and visual transmission from the bridge. The image of Commander Xanthus materialized, hovering a foot above the command deck. The alien was massive, but he no longer looked invincible. Frost clung to the edges of his chitinous armor, and his mandibles clicked with a sluggish, shivering rhythm. The DARPA translation module on David's data pad buzzed, struggling to convert the audio through the ship's failing systems. Human, Xanthus rasped, the translated voice echoing from the ECC's overhead speakers with a metallic distortion. You are committing suicide. Environmental extremes you have initiated will inevitably breach this room's localized life support. You will freeze alongside my crew. David leaned back in the stolen ergonomic chair, wiping a smear of grease and synthetic alien blood from his cheek. He reached into his tool belt, pulling out a heavy, chrome-plated snap-on wrench, and tapped it thoughtfully against his palm. I'm from Ohio, pal, David said, his voice surprisingly steady. I've waited for the bus in. Put on a sweater. Xanthos's eyes, black and segmented like a wasp's, narrowed. What special operations unit do you belong to? Orbital drop shock, the Palantir Black Ops Division. We scan your vessel. There were no military assets aboard the Tether. I work for Aegis Facility Services, David replied, picking up a half-empty jug of the chalky nutrient paste he had scavenged. He took a grim sip, fighting the urge to gag. I'm a sanitation contractor. You guys left a mess in sublevel 4. I was just trying to clean it up before you kidnapped me. The silence that followed was heavy. Xanthos stared at the human, his alien mind failing to compute the variables. A supreme dreadnought, the pinnacle of Zelothi Engineering brought to its knees not by a coordinated cyber warfare strike or a tactical nuclear barrage, but by a janitor with a toolbox and a fundamental understanding of thermodynamics. You are lying, Xanthos spat. No labor possesses the knowledge to bypass a core mind root directive. Your core mind is an idiot, David said. Bluntly, it doesn't know the difference between a real temperature drop and a sensor smothered in industrial degreaser. You build a ship that thinks too much and doesn't feel anything. Now here's the deal. You are going to drop this ship out of slip space right now, or I'm going to take this a step further. We are 30 hours from the Mars colony. Xanthos sneered, defiance hardening his voice. Even if you kill every soul on this vessel, the automated navigational thrusters will maintain the trajectory. The ship will exit slip space, and the kinetic impact alone will shatter the new Austin domes. You have delayed the inevitable waste extractor, you have not prevented it. David's stomach tightened. He had frozen the crew, but the ship was still a bullet fired straight at 2 million people. He looked down at his data pad, frantically scanning the translated schematics. Xanthos was right. Navigation was locked behind a separate, hardened physical firewall on the bridge. David couldn't steer the ship, and he couldn't hit the brakes, but he could blow the engine. You think so? David muttered, his eyes tracing the massive blue-coated lines that represented the ship's primary slip space drive coolant system, the Zalothi. Slip space engine operated on contained exotic matter reactions. It generated heat equivalent to a small star to keep the ship from vaporizing itself. Millions of gallons of super-chilled liquid helium derivatives were pumped through the engine manifold every second. Commander Xanthos, David said, his finger hovering over the holographic terminal. Do you know what happens when you close a pressure valve on a water main without a dampener? Xanthos did not answer. It's called water hammer, David explained, a grim smile crossing his face. The kinetic energy of the fluid has nowhere to go. It spikes the pressure. It blows the pipes apart. Now, what do you think happens if I slam the main emergency shutoff valves on your slip space drive coolant lines all at exactly the same time? Panic finally broke through the alien commander's stoic facade. You cannot. The thermal feedback will cause a cascading quantum collapse. The drive will tear the ship apart in the slipstream. We will be scattered across a dozen dimensions. Then I guess we're taking a detour, David said. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't want to hear Xanthos negotiate. He slammed his palm onto the holographic execution command. Deep in the bowels of the obsidian spear, massive physical bulkheads slammed shut, instantly severing the flow of the super-chilled coolant to the active slip space drive. For 3 seconds nothing happened. Then the universe screamed. The sound wasn't noise, it was physical pain. The sheer unfathomable heat of the uncooled space drive caused a catastrophic expansion within the engine housing, the localized gravity field that allowed the dreadnought to traverse the higher dimensions violently collapsed. David was thrown from his chair, hitting the metal deck so hard his vision whited out. The ship violently snapped back into real space. The deceleration forces were apocalyptic. Without the inertial dampeners fully powered, the sheer G-force tore heavy consoles from their mounts. The reinforced viewport of the ECC cracked, A web of splintered glass. Obscuring the view, emergency bulkheads crashed down throughout the ship, sealing off sections that were venting atmosphere into the cold vacuum of space. The violent shuddering lasted for what felt like an eternity, the metal groaning as if it were being chewed by some colossal beast, and then a dead, terrifying silence fell over the obsidian spear. David lay on the floor, gasping for breath. His ribs felt cracked, his left arm was numb. He slowly forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the console. The red emergency lights had failed. The only illumination came from the faint, dying glow of the holographic interfaces. He checked the telemetry. The slip space drive was completely offline, essentially melted into a block of useless slag. He looked at the external sensors. They weren't at Mars. They were floating dead in the darkness, somewhere near the orbit of Jupiter. David slumped back into the chair. He had done it. He had stopped the bullet. But the localized heaters in the ECC were finally failing, overwhelmed by the systemic freeze he had initiated across the rest of the ship. The temperature in the room was dropping fast. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shivering torso. He thought about his daughter in Baltimore, studying in the library at Johns Hopkins, completely unaware that her father was freezing to death 50 million miles away to make sure she could finish her exams. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness take him. 72 hours later, the radar arrays at Vandenberg Space Force Base picked up an anomaly. It was a massive radar signature, crippled and leaking radiation drifting aimlessly near the asteroid belt. The United Nations Security Council's reeling from the destruction of the orbital tether and preparing for a full-scale invasion immediately. Dispatched the UNS Armstrong, a heavily armed fast response cruiser captained by Robert Hayes. Captain Hayes stood on the bridge of the Armstrong, staring at the optical feed. Life signs, Hayes asked his sensor officer. Negative, Captain. The whole temperature is registering at -60 degrees C. Atmospheric scans show toxic levels of carbon monoxide and raw plasma exhaust. Sir, the ship looks like it tore itself apart from the inside out. Prepare a breaching team, Hayes ordered. Hazmat protocols, weapons free. We don't know what kind of trap the Xylac they're setting. A team of 20 elite Space Force commandos, clad in heavy vacuum-sealed power armor, breached the obsidian spear through shattered secondary airlock. They moved with absolute precision, expecting a bloodbath. Instead, they found a graveyard. Corridor after corridor, they found the fearsome Xylthi warriors, frozen solid, trapped in emergency bulkheads or suffocated in their own barracks. There was no sign of a battle, no plasma burns on the walls, just the eerie, absolute stillness of a ship that had been methodically, systematically shut down. Captain Hayes, this is Strike Team Alpha, the commando leader relayed, shining his high-lumen rifle light across the frozen corpse of Commander Xanthos on the bridge. The command crew is dead. Environmental systems appear to have been weaponized against them, but, sir, the computer logs indicate that override was initiated from the Environmental Command Center. Someone did this manually. Move to the ECC, Hayes ordered, his voice tight with confusion. Find out who or what took down a dreadnought. The commandos navigated the frozen, dark corridors, finally arriving at the buckled blast scored doors of the ECC. They forced the doors open with hydraulic jacks, the metal screeching in protest. The room was pitch black. The commando leader swept his light across the room, illuminating the frost-covered consoles. Then the beam of light caught a shape huddled in the corner. "Contact!" the leader shouted, raising his rifle. The shape didn't move. The commando slowly approached, his weapon trained on the figure. As he got closer, the light revealed not a terrifying alien weapon, but a human. He was wearing a heavily soiled blue jumpsuit with a patch of Aegis Facility Services sewn onto the chest. He was wrapped tightly in several thick alien emergency thermal blankets, his breath forming tiny clouds of ice crystals in the air. Next to him was a frozen jug of gray paste and a heavily dented snap-on titanium wrench. "David." Harrison slowly opened his eyes, squinting against the blinding light of the commando's rifle. He looked at the heavily armored soldier, his brain struggling to process the rescue. "You guys Earth?" David croaked, his lips cracked and bleeding. "Yes, sir," the commando said slowly, lowering his weapon in absolute bewilderment. "We're the Space Force." "Who are you? Where is the rest of your unit?" David managed a weak, exhausted chuckle that quickly turned into a cough. He reached down, grabbing his titanium wrench with a shivering hand, and held it up. "Just me," David whispered. "I'm the janitor, and you guys are late. I finished my shift 3 days ago when the UNS Armstrong returned to Earth." The truth of the Obsidian Spear was immediately classified. The public was told that an experimental automated defense grid had crippled the alien flagship, but within the highest echelons of the military, new protocol was established. The Zalithi Empire, terrified by the sudden and inexplicable loss of their greatest dreadnought, signed a permanent, unconditional peace treaty, believing humanity possessed a stealth operative program so advanced it defied physics. David Harrison didn't care about the treaties. He was quietly compensated with a classified pension fund managed through dummy corporations that ensured his daughter's tuition was paid 100 times over. He retired back to Cleveland, bought a small house with a heated garage, and never looked at the stars again. But occasionally, when he heard a pipe rattle in his basement, he would smile, knowing exactly how to fix it. If you enjoyed this classified deep dive into the real history of the Zalithi War and the blue-collar grit of David Harrison, you need to let the algorithm know this is the kind of HFY sci-fi storytelling that proves humanity's greatest weapon isn't a laser cannon, it's our stubborn, practical ingenuity and a refusal to just roll over and die. Don't let this story get lost in the slipstream. Hit that like button right now to boost the video and share it with anyone who loves a good underdog story where the janitor absolutely dominates an alien empire. If you want more gritty, realistic, and pulse-pounding human sci-fi dramas delivered straight to your feed, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment below. What tool would you bring to an alien warship? See you in the next one. Hi, my name is Tran Trong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, a human janitor was left behind on an alien warship. He took it over overnight. HFY story. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how ordinary someone can seem until the Moment they're pushed into something impossible. David wasn't a soldier or some genius hero, he was just a hard-working guy, using the skills he already had, and somehow that made the story feel even more human. There's something really satisfying about watching patience, experience, and quiet determination matter more than brute force. I also think the story gently reminds us not to underestimate ourselves or other people. Sometimes the things we do every day without thinking can become our greatest strengths when life gets difficult. Have you ever had a moment where practical knowledge or simple experience helped you more than talent or luck? And if you were trapped on that ship, what would have been the one tool or skill you'd trust the most? Thanks for spending time with us on Palace Truths. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment and maybe like or subscribe so we can keep sharing more HFY stories together.